are live. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another author interview here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia. Many of you know me as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe. And joining me today is a guest making their official debut on the show, but you actually may remember them from another show I did not too long ago. Now, my guest is a fantasy author who lives in northern Utah with his wife, kids, and multiple furry freeloaders. He writes at every opportunity since he can never schedule enough D&D campaigns to slake his thirst for storytelling. He graduated from Utah State University with a bachelor's degree in English creative writing and a minor in folklore. His mother instilled in him a love for books, and above all else, he hopes his stories will bring joy to their readers. And if you also remember this guest, he also told us about a story that he is working on with an amazing company known as Audiomazes. So without further ado, let's give a huge round of applause to a familiar face in the interwebs, Mr. Richard Pack. Richard, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Gabriel. Glad to be here.
Awesome, Richard. Well, I'm so excited to have you here on the Wandering Scribe show. Now, for viewers who are just now seeing you on this site, is there anything else you would like to add about your background, or did it pretty much cover it?
Well, it's a pretty short summary. I would just like to add that I've been writing stories since, elementary school, junior high, high school. I wrote dozens of short stories in my early 20s, and I'm just really excited that I have the chance to publish, get it in front of people.
Awesome, awesome. And as a little teaser for our viewers and listeners, are there any stories, your personal stories that you're working on that could potentially be published later this year? And if they are, what would you like to tell us about them as a little window into what we can expect?
Yeah. My main project currently is a series titled Tales of the Guildless.
Ooh.
It is a dark fantasy series set in a world where people can summon and control demons. Specifically, you can summon a demon into an object to enhance or empower that object. Although, depending on how strong the demon is, it might gain a mind of its own. Or you can summon a demon into a person, and that is how people in this world gain access to magic. So there is one story that will absolutely be published this year. It is a short story called Smokesmith. And then there is a longer novel that I'm also aiming to finish this year. I'm currently about 2/3 of the way done with the
Nice.
first draft. So still plenty of work to be done, but I'm hoping to get it out. And that one is called Bloodsmith. Both those
Nice.
titles, you'll notice a theme, obviously. In this world, that is what people are called when they are wielders of the magic. Based on the circumstances of the summoning, determines what kind of magic you have. So if a demon is summoned in a ritual that involves smoke, you're a smokesmith. There's more to it than that, but that's a very basic level. So like I said, Smokesmith is pretty much done. I'm just dotting some I's and crossing some T's, and then that one will be published, and then we'll hopefully get Bloodsmith out later this year.
Awesome. Well, that's incredible, Richard, and congratulations to you on that. That is amazing. So before we dive into that series, let's talk a little bit more about you. So from your bio, you've always been a very creative person. Your mother instilled this sense of reading. You've gotten a bachelor's in creative writing as well as a minor in folklore, and your mind is very, very into D&D. So I'm just curious, at what point did you realize that you could probably take your passion for creativity and build upon it to make a brand, your author career, so to speak?
Yeah. So I served a religious mission.
Mm.
And while I was serving that mission, there were a lot of rules about what we could and couldn't do. Totally understandable rules. But it meant that sometimes when it was late at night or we were walking or driving a long way, we kind of had to find ways to entertain ourselves, right?
Right.
And one thing I would often do with the missionaries I was working with would be basically play D&D without character sheets or dice, just basically telling a story, right? Having them say what the character would do, and then I would decide what happened next. Very simple Dungeons and Dragons style gameplay. And that was a lot of fun. It certainly helped with some of those, like I said, long walks, long drives, late nights where we had nothing else going on. But it was also just so satisfying to get that direct feedback, to have a person who was enjoying the story I was telling and enjoying it enough to get invested and to be excited about it. And not only did that help me to feel that sort of positive feedback that is obviously important for all creative people, but it also really built on my own skill at figuring out the stories that people want and giving them what they want while still surprising them. Because that's obviously always a very careful balance. You need to meet the right expectations and subvert the right expectations.
Yes, that is very true. That is absolutely correct. And it's actually really fun that you... Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, it's also really cool that, you know, as you mentioned, that with D&D, that it sort of fosters this creativity and just allows people to expand and sort of just play around with storytelling, which I think if people don't realize, that's kind of like one of the underlying things for D&D is that you are telling a story that you want to tell, a campaign you want to tell. Yes, there is a baseline premise for a certain D&D campaign, but you as the DM and your players get to decide how that story sort of just goes about. And again, that just fosters creativity, which is just amazing. So going forward from that, what would you consider your definitive aha moment where you realize at a certain moment in your life you want to take a gamble and start building your brand as an author?
Yeah, so that obviously was a big thing for me, but what really pushed me towards this is something I would love to do full time, given the opportunity. This is something, you know, the reason that I decided to fully commit to going to school for it and everything was National Novel Writing Month. NaNoWriMo. I'm sure that many of your listeners are aware of that. I have not done it in several years, but the very first time I did it was in 2011. And I'd had a story kicking around for a while. And I just went for it. And I succeeded that year. I wrote the entire novel over the course of that month of November. And having that completed book, which I would never publish now, to be clear, very much a product of the age I was and the very, I won't even say direct inspiration, and the media I was copying. I'm sure we all have books and stories like that. But having that finished work, being able to share that finished work. In fact, I even had a friend who printed a very simple copy of it, like you know, printer paper and staples, but still being able to hold that and have that was just a moment where I knew that if I could do this professionally, if I could write and share that with people and just have that opportunity to bring people into a world I created and to hear back from them in this complete form, because part of it is that D&D, as fun as it is, as much as I love it, it is inherently ephemeral, right? It is a session or a campaign at a time, and then it's done. Whereas a book lasts, and that was what really made me just know that that was what I wanted to do.
Awesome. That's amazing, Richard. And probably that leads perfectly now into the next portion of the question, which is, of course, the overall construction of your story. beginning with the first in this series. So let's start at the very beginning, Richard. So walk me through it. You're at your desk. You're now beginning to jot down the overall idea of how this series is going to go, and then going deeper into the first book from beginning to end. Now, when you began writing it, what were sort of the goals you had going into this story as the author, but also understanding the promises you're making to your future readers?
Yeah. So I'm going to focus on Bloodsmith since that's my current project, and
Okay.
it depends on the project.
Hmm.
But usually, when I am starting a book, it's because there are themes I want to explore and scenes I want to write. So when I'm first starting out, even often before I have characters set in stone, I will know on a basic level this is what the book is going to be about. In the case of Bloodsmith, it is about breaking away from individuals who are trying to control you, learning to think and act for yourself and make your own path in the world, and basically taking back agency that was taken away. So those were the themes from the start. And within that, I knew there would be a few scenes. First off, the prologue, which is available on my Substack if you want to read it, as well as several chapters from part one. I wanted to make sure that we started with a strong scene of what it was like to be forged. Forging is not a pleasant process.
No, it is not.
As you may imagine, specifically not when it involves a whole lot of blood. So the very first scene I always knew was going to be the prospective character being forged into a bloodsmith. And that experience and what it felt like and what the demon was like as it entered into their body. And I had a couple of other scenes early on of specific moments that I wanted to happen, specific character interactions. And what's funny is that at that point, even as I knew, here's where we start, here's some of the stuff in the middle, here's where we end, I still hadn't actually decided on the main character, which is not necessarily normal even for me. But to me, I was going to take the time to figure out the main character. And this is what I do with most of my stories. Once I was confident, I had a story worked out. And once I know that there is a story that I will enjoy writing, that I truly believe people will enjoy reading, I will flesh out those details. And in this case, I landed on the character of Imara. Imara is a teenager. For the bulk of the book, she's 17, 18. There are some parts further in the past, who was kidnapped by this group who forged her against her will. And that's when those other themes I talked about come in, because they basically convince her that very cult behavior, very intentionally, they convince her that they are the ones who she can trust, who can protect her. And then the incident in chapter 1 happens, which we can maybe talk about in more detail. But very basically, she has an opportunity to get away from that and to deprogram herself. And that is where the book goes from there. And it's a bit messy to explain because my process is messy. What's funny, if you looked at my manuscript right now, I have complete chapters that happen 2 or 3 chapters after where I'm currently writing, because these scenes were so strong and so powerful. I took the time to write them down. I have one of the major scenes with Imara at the end of part 2, even though I haven't, there's multiple bits of connective tissue missing. So I write out of order. And I'm afraid that when I've explained this, I've explained it out of order. It's probably just confusing.
The struggles of all of us authors. I know the feeling, Richard. But I absolutely get what you're saying, that for each project it's a little bit different, and of course you want to tackle on different themes for each project, which is, very true. Because I think now going into for my own story, for Decimus, you know, it may be part of like a series of books I like to write, but it's not like how I would typically write that same book from its predecessor. I want to always improve upon it. Almost like how you said how you wrote a book for NaNoWriMo, but it's vastly different in terms of, how it was written to the current series you're working on now. And I'm just very curious, Richard, when you began working on your current project, did you share it with family and friends, or are you keeping it reserved until it's not published, but it's like the final version before you would publish it?
Yeah, great question. I crave feedback. It's positive or negative. I don't care. I just want to know whether what I'm writing is working and was working about it. So as soon as I had enough of the story to feel like it was worth reading, in this case, all of part one, I shared it with a few trusted friends and family members just to get their opinion. And I find that very helpful. I was able to gauge from them, people who I would consider part of my target audience, what was working, what was not, what parts needed tightening up, what parts could maybe be dropped because they just weren't interesting, as well as just how the characters were working out. The one thing about the Bloodsmith, about the book, sorry, I promise, I'm an English major. You think I'd be able to keep my words straight. One thing about Bloodsmith is you obviously have the main character, Imara. You have two very important supporting characters who are with her for most of the book, Valorn and Castalla. And what I was worried about going in was that they might be overpowering or overbearing, because they are characters who I know the backstories for. The backstories are not an essential part of this book, and I wanted to make sure that it didn't feel like that was just hanging over and interrupting the current plot. So that was something I absolutely wanted feedback on sooner rather than later, because if that was a problem, I wanted to be able to work on it and fix it before I got all the way through the rest of the book and it turned into a load-bearing part of the structure.
Absolutely.
So I shared it with friends and family. I've done a couple of rewrites of part one. I'd say it's currently at about draft 2.5 is what I'd call it. I still have more work that I know needs to be done on that, but I did start sharing chapters of part one, like I mentioned on my Substack. And I'm deciding what to do with part two. Part two is not quite done. I am deciding whether I'm going to share that on Substack or just with friends or what. That's still up in the air.
Absolutely. And that kind of leads into the next question and talks about, sharing our work with people. Because as authors, we are hesitant and maybe a little reluctant to share our work with people beyond, of course, family and friends, but with strangers, because there is that hesitancy. Are people going to like it and enjoy it, especially if it's our first book? Now, I know we talked about this on the other show, Into the Maze, but it is very true that, as authors, we always want feedback. We always want, of course, critiques. As I was saying before that, as authors, we always have this hesitancy and reluctancy to share our work, especially if it's people who are not friends and family. And of course, that's a little bit difficult for us authors because, as you mentioned before, Richard, you yourself love getting feedback, whether it's good or bad, because it is very beneficial. But in today's digital age, that can be a double-edged sword, because on one side, you can get feedback from fellow authors, fellow writers, and readers of the genre who enjoy maybe not exactly your stories, but the type of stories you're writing. But on the other side, we do find ourselves exposed to a lot of hate speech, spam, trolls, which can lead to a lot of very negative feelings. And of course, very, very hamper and dampen one's mental health and, above all, confidence. And most importantly, imposter syndrome is always going to be in the back of everyone's mind. I don't care who you are, it's always going to be there no matter what. So, Richard, I am curious. As a writer, like all of us in this digital age, did you have any heightened anxiety or imposter syndrome when you began writing Bloodsmith, and of course, dabbling with part two? And if so, what has disciplined you to continue with this series as well as other projects you are currently working on?
Yeah, great question. So, imposter syndrome, absolutely, right? Um, I actually just finished an excellent book. It's called The Hike. Let me look at the author. I should have had this ready. By Drew McGarry. And this is not the sort of book I write, to be clear. It is not high fantasy. It is very intentionally, it is a fantasy book, but it's very different from what I write in a lot of unique ways. I'm not saying I would ever even write this book, but whenever I finish a good book like this one, I always ask what I'm doing with my life, because Drew McGarry within that book is able to tell a story that is at once extremely personal to the protagonist, but also just touches on so many universal human experiences, that touches on some really deep emotions and questions that inevitably shine a mirror back on the reader. And just everything about it is brilliant. The pacing, the characters, the story that is being told, and the inspirations are clear, but it is still absolutely its own thing. And when I read a good story like that, and obviously I could list plenty of others, but we'll use this as the most recent example. I always wonder, what am I offering? What is my unique thing that I'm offering to the world? When someone reads my book, will they come away with it having felt real emotions that matter, or is it at best empty calories? Right? Because I have enough confidence in myself to believe that my work meets a basic level of entertainment. And because of my schooling and because of my skill and practice with the art of writing, I know that there will be a basic standard of consistency.
Right.
There's a lot of authors who can do that, though. There's a lot of authors who can write stories that are entertaining and consistent. And many of them put out a whole ton of books. And to be clear, I'm not denigrating those authors. I'm just saying, like, I want to be the sort of author that makes people think, that makes memorable characters that will stick with people, not just something where they pick it up, they read it, they're done, they never think about it. And it is very difficult to see myself as that sort of author sometimes. And there's a couple of ways I fight against that. First off is I do seek that feedback early, and I seek it often. The worst feedback you can give me is nothing, or it's good. I want detail. I want to know what worked, what didn't. What do you remember about this character? How do you feel about this journey this character goes on? And if people don't have feedback for me on those things, that makes me feel that I have failed. So my biggest imposter syndrome actually comes when I have shared something and I don't get feedback.
Yes.
Because when I finish a good story, and that could be a book, it could be a movie. Recently finished season 2 of the show Andor, incredible. All I want to do is talk about it, right? I want to talk about it with other people who have experienced it, and I want to listen to other people talk about it on things like podcasts. I know I'm not the only one, because these sorts of podcasts and articles are very popular. And obviously you have sites like, Reddit and a lot of social media with entire sections dedicated just to talking about things people like. And I want my stories to be things other people talk about. And if they're not, then it freaks me out and I worry I have failed utterly.
Absolutely. And this actually brings up something that I haven't mentioned before on the show in a very long time. But it goes back to what you said, how, when you are writing a story, Richard, you want there to be some level of consistency, but also you want your readers to be entertained. Because at the end of the day, that's what a book should do. Above all else, it should be entertaining and it should hold the reader's attention.
Yeah.
Now, I've mentioned this in the past on the show that for a long time, I've always believed that, and some may disagree with me on this, that writers are liars, cheaters, and thieves. We make stuff up, we cheat people at time, and we always steal from each other because 9 times out of 10, the same story has been told over and over. And that part, a lot of people agree is true.
Mhm.
But as I've honed and still honing my craft as a writer and authoring my own stories, I've realized that there's something better to aspire as a writer, and what I call the 3 E's: educate, entertain, and enlighten. And I definitely feel that is something that should be the standard for all authors, for all genres. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, Richard. And as an add on, for you as an author, what do the 3 E's mean to you? Entertainment, educate, and enlighten.
Yeah. No, good question. Yeah, there's a real push for originality, and there is a lot to be said for originality. It is good to have new ideas. Um, but exactly like you said, every story has been told in some way, right?
Mm-hmm.
You obviously have the hero's journey, the monomyth, and that's not a perfect representative, but it certainly fits a lot of stories.
Yes.
And you can see so many archetypes that have been used and reused over and over again. And that's part of what I think was so important about doing folklore as a minor, that really helped me sort of come to terms with this. When you're in folklore, there are types of stories, and they have a very specific organization and classification system for these stories that you
Right.
can see going back thousands of years. There's something that not everyone knows, but the most common folklore story in the entire world is Cinderella. Uh, Obviously, there's variations, but the basic there is the girl who wants to go to an event. She receives magical help to go to the event and ends up married. As well as several other weirdly specific details are found throughout the world in cultures that definitely had never met each other before telling that
Right.
story. That is just a human story that has been
Mm.
with us for as long as we have had right now. And I think when you realize that, when you recognize that, you become a lot more honest about acknowledging and recognizing your inspirations. Just very briefly, Tales of the Guildless, it is absolutely very directly inspired by Jim Butcher's Codex Alera, with the elemental powers that are there, combined with a bit of the Bartimaeus series by Jonathan Stroud and how demons act there. And I took those two and I decided to make my own thing, and I think it's worthwhile. But no, I'm not the first person to have demons being summoned or elemental based magics or a character who's taken into a cult and deprogrammed. It comes back to what I am doing that is unique and that is worthwhile. And I like this 3E's model, as you mentioned, because there is a lot of, like I said earlier, empty calories. That's
Mm.
not a bad thing. Just like with food, we all need snack food sometimes. I don't want to be that author. And when I can focus on that's why I start with themes, right? We talked earlier about my writing process. That's why I start with themes, because when I start with a theme, when I'm able to say, there is a message I want the reader to understand by the end of this, there is a way I want them to feel about this world, about these characters, and this is how I want to express that. That helps me stay focused on the things that will make my story my story,
Right.
you know? So yeah, I hadn't heard that particular framework before, but I really like it. I think focusing on what your story does to the reader, and to be clear, there's lots of versions of that. What you're trying to do to the reader in a horror story is very different than what you're doing in a romance, is very different from what you're doing in historical fiction. But on a
Absolutely,
basic
that's
level,
true.
you want to reach out to the reader, you want to make a connection with the reader, and you want them to leave your story changed. And I think if you've done that, you've succeeded.
Very true, very true. And also to add to this, I haven't told a lot of people this when it comes to, the three E's for me. But of course, many people know that I'm working on my fourth book, Death Smith, The Wolf of Rome.
Mhm.
And what I haven't told people is what was the inspiration behind The Wolf of Rome, and more specifically, the story that I went with The Wolf of Rome, which is Hannibal conquering Rome and some of the Romans being sent up north to Gaul. Well, that actually comes from an old book from the early 2000s called The Children of Hannibal. I forgot the author's name, but The Children of Hannibal pretty much goes as follows. Hannibal wins the Punic Wars. He sends a majority of the Romans to Gaul, where they are forced to fight and live to survive. And Carthage, occupies it. Rome is theirs, but they don't really do anything with it. And from there, you have the main character who is a descendant of the Scipio family. I want to say Cornelius Scipio the second or the third, who leads a rebellion to fight back. And because the Romans have been fighting the Germans and the Gauls for decades, well, not decades, I should say, it's about almost over a century, they are hardened by war, whereas the Carthaginians have done nothing. So from there, that led to, okay, well, what can I do? Use that, but make it my own spin. Maybe it's not a century that the Romans have been fighting. Maybe it's only a few years, and they're not like, expert warriors, but they're just, trying to survive. Want to make it a little bit more accurate, as well, also in terms of, okay, what realistically would have happened. But of course, as you said, Richard, I want to make it my own thing. I want to make it unique. And I think for all authors, that's the one thing we want to achieve, is to get our voice out there. And everyone, I believe, shares that sentiment, which now leads into the next question, which I did ask you on Into the Maze, but maybe you can go a little more in depth on it, which is this discussion of, in this age now, post quarantine, post COVID years, that there's been an influx of independent creators, whether that's artists, musicians, or authors. And some argue that we are in a new age, a renaissance of some kind for independent creation. Some say that we are not, for numerous reasons. But for you, Richard, in your opinion, as a fellow author, do you believe that we are in a new age of creation, or we are on the path to be in a golden age or a renaissance?
Yeah. Oh, like everything, it's complicated. Publishing is so different than it was even when I was going to college, right? Even a decade ago, publishing is very different than it was. Much less if you go back 20, 30 years. A lot of the books you can find on advice on how to publish simply don't apply in any realistic way. And a lot of the older authors, this is one thing I really appreciate about Brandon Sanderson's writing lectures, for instance. He will freely admit that not only was the way he got into publishing pretty unique for the time, it definitely wouldn't work nowadays because it's just changed. And again, there's good and bad. Let's start with the good. Lots of room for indie publishing. It is easier to indie publish than ever before, especially if you're doing text, but even if you're doing audio, there are options where you can get it done for a reasonable price and get a reasonable royalty. Obviously, there's complications there, but you can get your stuff out in front of the world. And if you don't want to officially publish, you have sites like Archive of Our Own, like Substack, and you are going to find incredible work that people are putting up for free purely for the love of creation. And that includes writing, that includes art, that even includes film. There is truly amazing stuff being created every day, and we have opportunities to share it. Now, the downside of all of that is that it is difficult to stand out, right? It is difficult to get a contract with a traditional publisher who is going to do the legwork of advertising and getting tours and signing set up and all of that. And if you're not doing it through a publisher, that is extremely difficult to do on your own, not to mention expensive. And you're not always going to see a return on it. And so much of that work that I mentioned that is being shared for free is, being read by a dozen people, right? Who may love it, but in the end, the artist isn't getting support, isn't getting anything that can help them to continue to thrive artistically. And so I think that it is an excellent time for those who enjoy creative work. An excellent time for those who want to share their creative work. There are some definite struggles in turning creative work into a functional income.
That's true.
The majority of creators. There's obviously exceptions. I mean, I already mentioned Brandon Sanderson, but he is by far the outlier.
Yes, absolutely. What you said is very, very true, Richard. And you do give a lot of good points, which I very much agree that, yes, publishing has changed within the last 20 years. And especially for indie publishing, it's huge. A majority of authors whose books are featured in Barnes & Noble or independent bookstores are indie authors. And that is huge and that is incredible. But the downside is because there's such an influx of indie authors, it is a little challenging to stand out in your preferred genre without trying to be sort of fake in the sense of you're just writing a book just to, be part of the current trend or the tropes that everyone is writing about, which actually now leads into the business portion of being an author. So, as a little icebreaker question for this part, Richard, let's talk about the audience and add on to that, of course, the readership. So, firstly, the audience. Audience is probably the first thing that, as authors, that's drilled into us, conditioned, so to speak, that we have to know who our audience is and the genre we're writing for, as well as, where it belongs in the subcategories. But when we look at readership, some people write for their readers, people who like stories similar to them. And that has led to a discussion of what is more market savvy, marketing to a particular audience or marketing to a specific readership. Now, for you, Richard, for Bloodsmith, did you have a specific audience in mind or did you have a specific reader type in mind?
Yeah, absolutely. This is going to sound like the laziest answer, but very honestly, I want readers like me because I wanted to write the sort of book that I enjoy because that was the best way for me to guarantee other people would enjoy it too. I want readers who like a fleshed out fantasy world with a complex magic system that the reader can learn more about along with the characters, so that when there is a problem the magic system can solve, it makes sense. This is the hard magic system style, if you're doing hard versus soft. And on top of all of that, I wanted it to be something that addresses the darkness of the world without dwelling in it. Because I think it is good to have complex stories with characters who go through hard things. I know for myself, I don't enjoy reading those. I not to. It's the most obvious example. Game of Thrones is not my cup of tea.
Fair enough.
It's not. I prefer stories that can acknowledge that while still being about hope and the ability of people to make a difference. And obviously, it's a fantastical world. They're doing that with magic and, in my case, demons. And it's never going to be a perfect allegory, but it is. That's the sort of story I want to read. So that's the sort of story I decided to read.
Absolutely. Now, add on to that, in your opinion, Richard, when should the author consider either the audience or the readership? During the drafting phase or during the marketing phase?
No, that is a great question. I would say mostly the marketing phase. I'd say during drafting, you should at least think about it, because it can, if you're not careful, you can end up with a story that appeals to such a narrow niche that it's going to be very difficult to course through. I think it is worth considering during drafting. But for me, at least, you should write the story you want to write, and you should get it down, at least a first draft done, complete, and then think about fine tuning. And one of the things you can fine tune is your target audience.
Right.
I know this has happened to me many times, and I know this happens to most creatives. It is so easy to get bogged down in, this isn't perfect, this needs to change. I just realized that, XYZ is missing. Or, oh, I just read this other book, and that's probably what people would like more. And obviously, part of the drafting and writing process is that things are going to change. But if you get just stuck in the minutia of, oh, I have to fine tune this chapter until it's perfect, you are never going to finish it. And I think audience is one of those places where you can absolutely get bogged down if you're not careful.
Absolutely. 100%. And that kind of leads into another discussion as a course of, the readership is going to change when you initially write it, and of course, when you're going to publish it. And it's always important to understand what book falls under what readership, particularly if it's your own. And I don't know if in your inner circle of writers or fellow authors, or maybe you learned this in college, or maybe in your own private research, but from what I have learned, and correct me if I'm wrong, that in the publishing world, there's like 4 grades of readership. There's middle grade, which is for children, YA, which is for young adults, NA, which is for that transition period, new adults, and AF, adult fiction. Now, each readership group has its own set of unspoken rules when it comes to what types of stories are allowed and what things are not allowed in these types. And, for us authors, we really don't consider that at the time. We just write our story with maybe like a vague idea. It's like, okay, we're going to write this as a YA story. But after writing it, you may think of, oh, this is a little too much, a little too adult. Maybe not for like the graphic content, maybe the themes and discussions are a little bit too mature for the audience. So you may want to bump it up to AF. But I will say that there are a few books which are marketed as YA, but they are more suited for the adult fiction category. So, Richard, in your opinion, how important is it to really understand, your readership in terms of the book making process? Because again, audience is one thing, readership is another. But when it comes to marketing the readership, it's always good to figure out, okay, where exactly does the story belong? Because you don't want to get boggled down in like, no, I really want it to be this when it may not be that.
Yeah. No, that's a good question. And I read so many books that I quote unquote should not have read. Um, I read the Dragon Riders of Pern while I was still in elementary school, and those books are ones that are I'd say leaning young adult, but there's definitely some stuff in there that completely went over my head. And then I read it again when I was a bit older. I was like, oh. And I'm sure we've all had those moments. And I read plenty of others. And obviously those lines are fuzzy. And I think the fact that we even separate middle grade from young adult is a clear example of how those lines are fuzzy. Much less new adult, which is a relatively new thing in the,
Yes.
at least the popular zeitgeist of when you're talking about age ranges. And it's because it depends on the person, it depends on the reader.
Right.
There are books I am glad I read when I did, even though they're the sort of books that get banned because they are seen as explicit or inappropriate. A really good example is The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian by Sherman Alexie. That book talks about a lot of sexual stuff. That's not the main point of the book, but it is there. And because of that, there are a lot of people who say that it shouldn't be read by junior high and high school students, even though that's exactly who it's about. It's about the author when he was that age. It's about his experiences at that age. And it is very real and true to that experience. Not, that everyone has exactly, those moments in their life, but that being a teenager is complicated and it's messy. And there are going to be things that make you uncomfortable, and that's okay. So sorry, that's a little bit of a soapbox. I'll get back to your main point. I think that within reason, there are obviously exceptions to this.
Right.
As an author, you should write what you are comfortable with and then get it in front of readers. Right? I think if you are pushing yourself to make it more graphic, more adult, more explicit, it's gonna stand out.
Right.
And if you are purposefully defanging a scene, people are going to notice that unless you do it well.
Mm-hmm.
And you never know until you get in front of readers how they're actually going to feel about it. So that's what I try to do, and that would be my advice, is write to level you're comfortable with, get it in front of readers who you can trust to give good feedback.
100%, Richard. Absolutely. And it also leads into another discussion of course, this tightrope balance between, authors wanting to write stuff that they want to write, but also being aware of the genre that they're writing in, as well as the expectations, maybe a little bit unrealistic, from authors of the past. That tightrope issue, which again is a very delicate balance to uphold. Especially, of course, when we as authors want to write stories that we are comfortable with writing, but also tell the stories that we want to tell. And another thing I think is important to note, as many of you are just learning about this now, Richard and I actually talked on another show called Into the Maze, where Richard was telling me about a story that he was writing for a company called Audiomazes. Now, that name sounds familiar. It should. I've had a few guests from Into the Maze make their debut on this show as well. Now, Richard, when you began writing your story for Audiomazes, how was it working for a company that sort of really pushed forward this idea of liberty in terms of creative writing? Of course, making the author aware that these are the types of stories that we are looking for, in the sense of, nostalgia from the 90s, those real good moments, but not have it be, what's the word? I think of a phrase, but like gunpoint to someone says saying you have to write stories like these. It's just making you aware that those are the stories they're looking for, but trusting you to make those stories while also showcasing your individuality.
Yeah. So Audiomazes is the first time since, college, where I have been really strictly writing to an assignment.
Mm.
And honestly, it has been helpful because having deadlines is huge.
Yeah.
And there's only so much you can do when you're the only one imposing deadlines. Having a strict word count helps me stay focused. And having a theme helps me with my brainstorming. I'm going to go on a brief tangent about World Spark,
Okay.
which is the book I currently have published through Audiomazes. I was trying to decide what I was going to write. I was looking at the monthly theme, and I had so many ideas. I was thinking, could I write a story set in the same world as Bloodsmith, right? Another Tales of the Guildless story. Could I write in my sci-fi world, Shipfall, which we haven't talked about? Don't worry about it. You can read more on my Substack if you want to know about that one. Or could I write based on this idea or this idea? And I was all over the place. But having that theme, that strict theme, really helped me to narrow it down to where I came to a story I wanted to write, a story I was interested in. And then I was able to work back and forth with Colton, who's the narrative director, and sort of sift out the fine details, figure out exactly how we were going to make this work. And then once we were in sync, I was able to start writing. And that was so helpful to me because I knew it helped me get the story down, get the idea. And then I had a goal with a word count and a date that I was trying to hit. And I had the formatting, I was making it work for me. And all of those things together let me tell a story I wanted to tell about exploration and adventure and history and folklore and all these other elements, along with my own magic system I came up with phoenixes. But in this way, they kept that all contained, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
There's going to be a bit of a weird tangent. Stay with me for a moment.
All right.
A corset properly worn is an incredible thing. Corsets are the obvious example because most things where you see a corset being used is just, oh, it's painful. Oh, it's so uncomfortable. My wife and several other women I know would absolutely tell you a corset properly worn is a wonderful thing. Really, any properly fitting clothes will feel good and make you look and feel good. The way you're presenting yourself as well as physically. That's a bit of a tangent, but it's on the point, right?
Mm-hmm.
That Audiomazes provides a mold that you are able to fill with what you want to write, but it keeps it just tight in a way that is really helpful for writing, for editing, and then obviously getting help with the publishing is huge. And I'm really happy with the way the story turned out, and I know it is better than it would have turned out if I had tried to write something like this on my own.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Richard. And I'll make sure to include the link to Audiomaze down below in the description near the end of this video. And speaking of the end, we have now arrived at the final question, Richard, which I would love to hear your thoughts on. So add a little context to this question. Here it is. So we've talked about, all the things that, writing has done, like, the positives, the negatives, the hindrances, the benefits, and so forth. But I think the one thing we haven't talked about is breaking the romanticy nature of being an author. And what I mean by that is this from another guest I had on the show not too long ago, Garrett, who stated that people have this fantasy view of what it is to be an author, that it is the one career that you can make a lot of money in and be set for life. Well, that is not the truth, viewers and listeners. Would I like to be true? Yes. Would Richard like that to be true? Absolutely. But of course, that is not the case. But the problem is that seems to be the running discussion, at least for some groups who believe that, writing is a very get rich quick job. It's not. It's a lot of hard work, dedication. It's writing a story that may or may not be financially suitable or may make you a lot of money. Now, are there exceptions to the rule? Of course, absolutely. Has the publishing world changed with the new influx of writers? Absolutely. But even with the changes in the publishing world, as well as the influx of independent authors, there is no guarantee that it's going to be the start of one's legacy. And that is a hard pill to swallow. So, Richard, with all that said, here is the final question. If you were working with a fellow author, maybe in a writer's group, or maybe you were just meeting them at a convention somewhere and they were telling you their ideas of a story and what they wanted to achieve in this industry, how would you make them understand this notion that, well, yes, I like where your idea is, you have passion, but I just want to let you know that there is no guarantee that there is going to be like anything from that, not to, of course, be a Debbie Downer, but to make them realize that this is an industry where you really have to work and grow, and every setback has to be seen as a learning experience.
Yeah. This is with so many parts of life, but yeah, with writing specifically, what has made the difference for me is focusing on the little victories and enjoying them for what they are. Right? I know that there is not going to be a time anytime soon where I'm going to be able to replace my dude. And instead, writing is something I do because I enjoy doing it.
Right.
And when there are opportunities to get stuff out to the world, to get stuff published, I take them and I appreciate them for what they are. I'd say related to that is advice I would give in most any part of life. You miss 100% of the shots you don't take.
Mm-hmm.
Look for opportunities, apply to contests, apply to magazines. There's always going to be people who are looking for creatives, and be careful, right? Don't let people take advantage of you.
Of course.
But get your writing out there, get feedback, and use that to fuel your next project. But put very simply, write because you enjoy it. Anything else is a bonus.
That is perfectly said, Richard, and a perfect ending to this incredible author's interview here on the show. Thank everyone for joining us for another amazing episode here on the show. A huge thank you to my friend Richard for coming on The Wandering Scribe, making his official debut, as well as if you are waiting for his episode for Into the Maze, it will be coming out very soon. Until that time, Richard, where can people find you on social media if they want to reach out and connect with you, as well as pre-order a copy of Bloodsmith in the Works?
Yeah, so the best place to follow me is going to be on Substack. I am The Emerald Worm, at The Emerald Worm, or my publication is called Emerald Worm's Den. That is worm spelled with a Y because I am a nerd and I love dragons. Other than that, you can also follow me on Blue Sky. That is the other place I will do most of my updates. On Blue Sky, I am at theworm.bluesky.social. And links to those will be in the description. But any updates about my writing, Smokesmith one's coming out, Bloodsmith one's coming out, will be at those places. And finally, you can follow my Audiomazes profile as well.
I will link all those down below in the description of this video. So make sure everyone to go and check them out. And again, thank you everyone for joining us for another amazing author's interview here on the show. A huge thank you to my friend Richard for coming on the show. We wish him the very best. Hopefully we can have him back again for a follow-up interview for a sequel in his series, as well as a teaser for another book he is writing for Audiomazes. So make sure to follow him on all social media platforms to stay up to date. As always, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, this is the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill signing out. Wishing you all a wonderful day wherever you are in the world. And until next time, we'll see you all in the next video.